She was the ghost on the 50th floor, the cleaner he never knew existed. He was the billionaire CEO with his entire legacy on the line. To save her brother, she needed a miracle. To save his company, he needed a date. So he made her an offer that would change everything. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this amazing story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and how your day is going. All right? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The sound that had come to define Jane Morales' life was not the vibrant, chaotic symphony of her Pilsen neighborhood, nor the soft scratch of charcoal on paper as she brought her designs to life. Instead, it was the low, solitary whir of a commercial-grade buffer gliding across the endless expanse of polished marble. Here, on the 50th floor of the Innovatech Tower, silence was a commodity, and her job was to make it gleam. Outside the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of downtown Chicago glittered, a sprawling, indifferent galaxy she could observe, but never truly touch. Each pinprick of light represented a life, a story, a world away from her own, which smelled perpetually of expensive lemon polish and the faint, sterile scent of recycled air conditioning. She moved in a practiced rhythmic dance, her reflection a ghostly twin sliding across the floor's mirror-like surface. This was her nightly meditation, a numbing routine that kept the wolves of worry at bay, wolves that had sharp teeth and were named Leo, hospital bills and eviction notices. She was a phantom in this glass castle, a necessary but unseen function, as much a part of the building's infrastructure as the wiring in the walls. And in her invisibility, she had found a strange, lonely kind of peace. That peace was shattered by a sound so out of place in the midnight emptiness that it made her flinch. The soft, definitive click of a high-end latch. The door to the CEO's corner office, a place she usually cleaned in. The pre-dawn hours, when it was guaranteed to be empty, swung inward. Benjamin Davenport stood there, a man whose face she knew intimately from the cover of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, but whom she had never seen in the flesh this close. He was supposed to be a photograph, a headline, an abstract concept of power and wealth, not a flesh-and-blood man with his tie loosened and the severe lines of his face clouded with a profound human exhaustion that she recognized in her own mirror every morning. He didn't bark at her to leave, nor did his eyes glaze over her as if she were a piece of furniture. Instead, he simply watched her, his gaze holding an unnerving focus. For one dizzying, terrifying moment, Jane Morales ceased to be a ghost. She was seen. The silence stretched thick and heavy, punctuated only by the hum of her machine. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried a resonant timbre that seemed to fill the cavernous space. "I need a date for the Sterling Gala. On Saturday." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers, assessing her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "I'll pay you $20,000. The buffer died with a pathetic whine, its motor spinning down into oblivion. In the subsequent deafening silence, the only sound left was the frantic, terrified, and traitorously hopeful thumping of her own heart against her ribs. The journey home on the L train was a disorienting blur, the familiar clatter of the wheels on the track doing little to ground her. Benjamin Davenport's offer echoed in her mind, each word a stone cast into the placid, desperate pool of her life, its ripples expanding into tidal waves of possibility and peril. $20,000. It was a ludicrous, impossible sum, the kind of money people like her only dreamed of in lottery fantasies. It was the amount that stood between her brother, Leo, and a surgery that could halt the relentless progression of his illness. It was freedom from the crushing weight that settled on her chest every time she looked at the growing stack of medical bills on her kitchen counter. As she stepped off the train and into the vibrant, mural-splashed streets of her Pilsen neighborhood, the contrast was jarring. The cold, sterile air of the 50th floor was replaced by the warm, inviting scent of frying tortillas and the distant, rhythmic pulse of cumbia music. This was her world, rich with color and life, but perpetually struggling. Her small apartment, though meticulously clean, was a testament to that struggle. The worn but beloved sofa, the second-hand furniture she'd lovingly repainted, and everywhere stacks of art books and her own sketch pads filled with brilliant, unrealized designs that were the currency of her true self. Her eyes landed on a framed photo on the bookshelf, a laughing, vibrant Leo, his arm thrown around her shoulders, taken a year ago before the sickness had stolen the light from his eyes. The thought of him, pale and listless, in a hospital bed, solidified the terrifying offer into a concrete, unavoidable choice. The next morning found her in a place that had become her second, more dreaded home, the sterile beige waiting room of the pediatric neurology ward. The air here was thick with a unique blend of antiseptic and quiet despair, punctuated by the rhythmic, unnerving beeps of distant machines. Mothers and fathers sat hunched over, their faces etched with a familiar weary anxiety, their gazes fixed on nothing. Jane clutched a lukewarm paper cup of coffee, the bitter taste doing little to cut through the lump of fear in her throat. She had spent countless hours in these uncomfortable plastic chairs, trying to lose herself in her sketchbook while waiting for news about Leo. Dr. Evans eventually emerged, her expression kind but professionally guarded. "Jane, his latest tests show the new medication isn't as effective as we'd hoped," she explained gently, her voice low. "We really need to move forward. With the surgical option, it's our best chance to give him a real quality of life, but the hospital requires a significant down payment to schedule it, and your insurance." She trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. Jane knew what the insurance did. Not enough. It was a cruel joke of the American healthcare system, a lifeline dangled just out of reach. "How much?" Jane asked, her voice barely a whisper, though she already knew the number, a figure that had haunted her dreams. For months, the initial deposit is $20,000. The doctor's words were not a proposal, they were a verdict, and in that moment, Benjamin Davenport's proposition ceased to be an indecent one. It became the only one. That evening, her apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in on her as she paced back and forth, the phone feeling like a 50-pound weight in her hand. She had called her best friend Maya, needing a lifeline of her own, a voice of sanity in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. "Are you out of your mind, Jane?" Maya's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp with concern. "This is insane. You can't seriously be considering this. He's your boss, a CEO. These guys, they live on a different planet. This has disaster written all over it in big flashing neon letters." Jane sank onto her worn sofa, running a hand through her hair. "Maya, I saw Leo today. I saw the doctor. They need the money, and they need it now. What other choice do I have? Sell a few freelance logos for $50 a pop? It would take me a decade to save that much." "There are other ways," Maya insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "We can do a fundraiser, a GoFundMe. And raise what? A few thousand, maybe?" "It wouldn't be enough, and it wouldn't be in time," Jane countered, the harsh reality of her situation steeling her resolve. "This is one night, Maya. One night of playing dress-up for a sum of money that could literally save my brother's life. I just have to pretend. I'm good at pretending. I pretend I'm not exhausted every day. I pretend I'm not terrified for Leo. I can pretend to be some rich guy's girlfriend for a few hours." A heavy sigh came from the other end of the line. "Just be careful, Jay, please. Men like that, they don't just give away money without expecting something more than what's in the contract. There are always hidden costs." The warning lingered in the air long after she hung up, a cold premonition. But the image of Leo's weakening smile was stronger. With a trembling finger, she dialed the number on the crisp business card Benjamin Davenport had left for her. When his assistant answered, Jane's voice was steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside her. "This is Jane Morales," she said, her tone firm and clear. "Please inform Mr. Davenport that I accept his offer." The meeting to formalize their agreement took place 2 days later, not in his panoramic office, but in a soulless glass-walled conference room on the 48th floor. The long, polished mahogany table felt like a battlefield between them, and the document placed in front of her was the treaty. It was a non-disclosure agreement, thick with dense legalese that made her head spin. Clauses about confidentiality, misrepresentation, and penalties for breach were laid out in cold, black ink. It was a document designed to protect him, his company, and his reputation, while she was merely a temporary, indemnified asset. Benjamin sat opposite her, the picture of professional stoicism, his suit impeccably tailored, his demeanor as crisp and unyielding as the contract itself. "The terms are simple," he began, his voice devoid of the exhaustion she'd seen that night. This was the CEO. "For the duration of Saturday evening, from 7 p.m. until I return you to your residence, you are Isabel Thornton. You are an art curator, specializing in modern European sculpture. Your family is in Greenwich, Connecticut. You attended Yale. We met through a mutual acquaintance at an art auction in New York 2 months ago. You will commit these details to memory. You will not speak of your real life, your job, or your brother. You will be charming, intelligent, and unobtrusive. In return, the sum of $20,000 will be wired to your account Monday morning." He slid a pen across the table. "This is a purely transactional arrangement, Ms. Morales. There is to be no genuine personal connection. Is that understood?" The question was a dismissal, a reinforcement of the chasm between their worlds. She met his cool, gray eyes, refusing to be intimidated. "Perfectly, Mr. Davenport," she replied, her voice steady. "You need a prop, and I need the money. The transaction is very clear." She signed her name with a flourish, the scratch of the pen the only sound in the room, sealing a deal that felt both like a lifeline and a betrayal of everything she was. As she pushed the signed contract back towards him, her worn canvas tote bag, which she had placed on the table beside her, shifted, and her sketchbook slid partially out. It was a beat-up, beloved thing, its cover softened with use and stained with charcoal smudges, its pages filled with the vibrant, silent language of her soul. For a fleeting second, Benjamin's gaze dropped to the book, a flicker of something unreadable, curiosity perhaps, crossing his features before his professional mask snapped back into place. He ignored it completely, his focus returning to the business at hand, as if he hadn't seen the small, intimate glimpse into her real world at all. "My assistant has scheduled a series of appointments for you tomorrow," he stated, his tone all business once more. "You will be provided with everything you need. A car will pick you up at 10 a.m. sharp." The finality in his voice was like a gavel striking down, signaling the end of their meeting and the beginning of her transformation into Isabel Thornton. Jane simply nodded, gathering her bag and the flimsy carbon copy of the NDA, feeling the weight of the lie she was about to inhabit settle upon her shoulders like a lead cloak. Walking out of that sterile conference room, the chasm between them felt wider than ever, a vast, unbridgeable canyon of class, wealth, and power. She was no longer Jane Morales, the invisible cleaning lady. She was now a contracted performer, and her life, for one night, was no longer her own. The thought was both liberating in its financial promise and utterly terrifying in its personal cost. The makeover, as Benjamin's assistant had termed it on the briskly efficient itinerary, began on Michigan Avenue, Chicago's famed Magnificent Mile. The Blacktown car, a silent vessel of luxury that was utterly foreign to Jane, deposited her outside an exclusive boutique whose name she had only ever seen in glossy magazines. The interior was a minimalist temple of beige and brushed steel, where clothes weren't simply displayed on racks, but were presented like museum artifacts. The sales associates, impossibly chic women with brittle smiles, sized her up in an instant, their eyes flicking over her practical jeans and worn boots with thinly veiled disdain. Jane felt her spine stiffen, the familiar sting of being underestimated coiling in her gut. Then Benjamin Davenport walked in behind her, and the atmosphere shifted instantaneously. The brittle smiles melted into fawning deference as he quietly confirmed his appointment. For the next hour, Jane was a doll being dressed by strangers, a mannequin brought to life. She was zipped, pinned, and draped in silks and velvets, the price tags on the gowns astronomical enough to make her feel dizzy. A floor-length emerald silk dress was deemed almost perfect, a crimson gown too dramatic. She felt ridiculous, a fraud in borrowed feathers. The entire experience a humiliating reminder of the world she was temporarily trespassing in. "What do you think of this one?" a sales associate asked, gesturing to a sapphire blue creation that shimmered under the gallery lighting. It was beautiful, elegant, and felt as alien to her as a second skin. Before she could answer, Benjamin stepped forward, circling her with a critical, impersonal eye. "It will suffice," he said, not to her but to the associate. "We'll take it and find her the appropriate shoes and accessories." It was during the shoe selection that a tiny crack appeared in the solid wall of their transaction, presented with a pair of silver stilettos that looked more like instruments of torture than footwear. Jane couldn't suppress a snort of laughter. "I'm sorry," she said, catching his eye, "but I'm pretty sure walking in those would violate several workplace safety regulations. I'd need a hard hat and a liability waiver." For the first time since that night in his office, a genuine, unplanned emotion flickered across his face. The corner of his mouth twitched, and a brief, surprising glimmer of humor lit his gray eyes. "I'll take the risk," he murmured, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. It was a small moment, almost imperceptible, but it changed the temperature in the room, a brief thaw in the icy formality between them. The shared joke, however fleeting, made her feel less like a prop and more like a person. Just as she was beginning to relax, however, disaster loomed. As she stood precariously in the towering heels, admiring the surprisingly elegant line they gave her legs, a familiar voice cut through the boutique's hushed atmosphere. Janie Morales, is that you? My goodness, child, what are you doing in a place like this?" Jane's blood ran cold. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, her sweet but incorrigibly nosy neighbor from down the hall. The older woman was beaming at her, her eyes wide with curiosity, as she took in Jane's half-glamorous state and the imposing figure of Benjamin Davenport standing nearby. Panic seized Jane's chest. This was it. Her cover was blown before the charade had even begun. Mrs. Rodriguez's gaze shifted to Benjamin, a speculative glint in her eye. "And who is this handsome young man?" Thinking faster than she ever had in her life, Jane summoned a dazzling smile, linking her arm through Benjamin's with a familiarity that was pure performance. His body went rigid with surprise, but he didn't pull away. "Mrs. Rodriguez, how wonderful to see you," Jane gushed, her voice a pitch higher than usual. "This is Ben, my cousin from out of town." She gave Benjamin's arm a subtle but firm squeeze, a silent plea for him to play along. "He has absolutely terrible taste and was insisting I buy this hideous dress, can you imagine? I was just telling him how much you'd hate it." Mrs. Rodriguez, momentarily distracted by the opportunity to offer a fashion critique, peered at the sapphire gown. "Oh, I don't know, dear. The color is lovely on you, very sophisticated." Jane saw her opening. "Well, it's been a debate. We should really get going, though. We're late for lunch." "With Aunt Carol. So good to see you." She practically dragged a stunned but silent Benjamin towards the exit, leaving her neighbor looking slightly bewildered but satisfied. Once outside on the bustling sidewalk, she released his arm, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected him to be angry, to reprimand her for the improvisation and the physical contact. Instead, he looked at her with a new, appraising expression. The corner of his mouth was twitching again. "Your cousin?" he asked. One eyebrow raised. With the terrible taste, a reluctant laugh escaped her. "It was the first thing that came to my head. Better than my billionaire boss who is paying me an obscene amount of money to be his fake date, don't you think?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze lingering on her, thoughtful and intense. "You think quickly, Ms. Morales," he finally said, his tone no longer just that of an employer. "That could be a very useful skill." The compliment, coming from him, was as unexpected and disarming as his brief smile, leaving Jane to wonder just what kind of battlefield she was preparing to walk onto. The final hours leading up to the gala were a surreal whirlwind. A woman with a sleek black bob and a case full of brushes and powders that looked like surgical instruments arrived at Jane's small apartment, a stark intrusion of Benjamin's world into hers. She sat on her own dining chair, facing her own slightly streaked bathroom mirror, as this stranger, Chantal, expertly transformed her face, erasing the tired shadows under her eyes and sculpting her features into an elegant, unfamiliar version of herself. Another artist worked on her hair, twisting and pinning it into a sophisticated chignon that made her neck feel long and graceful. All the while, Jane's own vibrant, chaotic paintings and sketches on the walls seemed to watch the process, silent witnesses to her temporary metamorphosis. When they were finished, she looked in the mirror and saw Isabel Thornton staring back. She was beautiful, poised, and a complete stranger. The sapphire dress, now perfectly tailored, felt like a second skin, and as she fastened the clasp on the heavy, glittering sapphire necklace Benjamin had selected, loaned, she reminded herself, just loaned, the weight of her borrowed identity felt both suffocating and strangely powerful. It was armor, an exquisite diamond-encrusted cage. A knock at the door signaled his arrival. When she opened it, Benjamin Davenport stood on her threshold, looking out of place and overwhelmingly present against the backdrop of her cluttered, colorful life. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, the epitome of wealth and power. But as his eyes met hers, all the words he might have prepared seemed to fail him. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her, not with the critical eye of an employer assessing his purchase, but with something else, something deeper and more unguarded. For the second time, Jane felt truly seen by him. And this time it wasn't terrifying, it was something far more complicated. The ride to the Drake Hotel was a cocoon of tense silence. The city lights streamed past the tinted windows of the town car, painting fleeting patterns on their faces. The enormity of what they were about to do settled heavily in the space between them. Jane's hands, clutching a small, borrowed silver clutch, were clammy. She recited the details of Isabel Thornton's life in her head. Like a mantra, Yale, Greenwich, modern sculpture, Benjamin stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, a muscle flexing periodically in his cheek. He seemed a world away, already embroiled in the battles he expected to fight inside the Grand Hotel. "Are you ready?" he asked as the car slowed, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the plush leather seats. She turned to him, the sapphire necklace cold against her skin. She wasn't ready. She was a cleaner from Pilsen about to walk into a piranha tank, armed with nothing but a pretty dress and a fabricated story. But then she thought of Leo, of the $20,000, of the small, defiant spark of her own competence that Benjamin had unwittingly acknowledged. She was more than they thought she was. "Yes," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. "I'm ready." As they pulled up to the hotel's magnificent entrance, a dazzling chaos of flashing camera bulbs, shouting paparazzi, and streams of Chicago's elite draped. In jewels and designer gowns, Jane took a deep, steadying breath. This was it, the performance of a lifetime. Benjamin exited the car first, a picture of calm, commanding authority. He turned and offered her his hand. His touch was warm and firm, a startling point of contact in the cold, formal landscape of their arrangement. She took it, allowing him to help her from the car. The roar of the crowd and the blinding lights were a physical assault on the senses. For a moment, she was just Jane, overwhelmed and out of her depth. But then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and let the armor of Isabel Thornton settle into place. She smiled a small, enigmatic smile for the cameras, just as she imagined a sophisticated art curator would. They began the slow walk up the red-carpeted steps, a convincing portrait of a handsome, powerful couple. But as they reached the grand gilded entrance of the ballroom, Jane's eyes were drawn to a woman standing just inside the doorway. She was impeccably dressed in a severe, cream-colored gown, her blonde hair styled in a sharp, unforgiving bob, a predatory, shark-like smile gracing her lips. Her name, Jane knew from the gossip columns Benjamin had made her study, was Victoria Sterling. And as Victoria's cool, calculating eyes swept past Benjamin and landed on Jane, her polite smile didn't falter, but something in her gaze shifted. It wasn't just a cursory glance at the CEO's new companion. It was a look of sharp, chilling, and undeniable recognition. The moment they stepped across the threshold into the Drake Hotel's Gold Coast ballroom, Jane felt as though she had been plunged into a sea of glittering predators. The cavernous room was a masterpiece of old-world opulence, with soaring, intricately carved ceilings from which massive crystal chandeliers dripped light like frozen waterfalls. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming lilies, vibrated with the murmur of 100 simultaneous conversations and the sophisticated strains of a live jazz quartet. Men in exquisitely tailored tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than her yearly income moved with a practiced, languid grace, their laughter sharp and their smiles calculated. Benjamin's hand was a firm, grounding pressure on the small of her back, a silent anchor in the overwhelming tide of sensory input. He leaned in, his voice a low hum against her ear. "That's Marcus Thorne of Thorne Industries. Avoid him. The woman in red is on the museum board. She'll talk your ear off about fundraising. Don't engage." He was her director, feeding her lines and blocking for a play she had never rehearsed. It was in the middle of this whispered briefing that a figure detached from a nearby group and glided towards them. It was Victoria Sterling, her cream-colored gown flowing around her like liquid moonlight, her smile as bright and dangerous as a shard of glass. "Ben, darling," she purred, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness that didn't reach her cold, assessing eyes. "I was wondering when you'd arrive, and you must be Isabel." Her gaze swept over Jane, a slow, meticulous appraisal that felt less like a greeting and more like a predator sizing up its prey. "An art curator, I hear. How utterly charming. You must tell me, is the modern art scene as dreadfully boring as it seems, or is it just the artists?" Jane felt Benjamin tense beside her, but before he could offer a clipped, defensive reply, she found her own voice, channeling the cool, unshakable confidence of the fictional Isabel Thornton. "I think that depends on whether you're looking at the art or just the price tags, Ms. Sterling," she replied, her tone light and pleasant, but with an underlying edge of steel. "True value is often hidden in plain sight after all. You just have to know how to look." The barb, subtle as it was, hit its mark. A flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed Victoria's face. She gave a tight, thin-lipped smile. "A clever answer. I see why you keep her around, Ben." She then turned her attention back to him, her voice dropping into a more serious conspiratorial tone. "The board is getting restless, you know. This Tanaka deal, it's a big gamble. Some are saying your leadership has become too impulsive. She let the word hang in the air, a perfectly aimed poison dart, before she drifted away back into the crowd, leaving a chill in her wake. Jane released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The brief exchange was more draining than an entire night of cleaning. This wasn't a party, it was a chessboard, and every word was a move, every smile a potential checkmate. She was beginning to understand the crushing weight that had exhausted the man standing beside her. For the next hour, Jane moved through the glittering throng, playing the part of Isabel with a skill that astonished even herself. Years of being invisible had honed her powers of observation to a razor's edge. While cleaning the offices of the powerful, she had been a silent witness to their world. She knew how they spoke, how they postured, how they masked their insecurities with bravado. Now, she deployed that knowledge. When introduced to a blustering tech mogul who dismissed modern art as splatters a child could make, she didn't argue. Instead, she smiled serenely and spoke about market volatility and the psychology of collectors, turning his own transactional language back on him until he was nodding in confused agreement. When a society matron asked a condescending question about her family in Greenwich, Jane regaled her with a completely fabricated but touchingly hilarious story about her fictional grandfather's feud with a neighbor over a prize-winning rosebush, a story she borrowed from the life of her own abuela in Pilsen. She was charming, witty, and just aloof enough to be intriguing. Through it all, she could feel Benjamin's gaze on her. She saw the initial surprise morph into a grudging respect, and then into something else entirely, a genuine, undisguised admiration. He had hired her to be a silent, beautiful prop. He had not anticipated that the prop would have a mind of her own, and a sharp one at that. Their primary objective for the evening materialized in the form of Mr. Kaito Tanaka, the CEO of a Tokyo-based tech giant whose partnership was critical for Innovatech's planned international expansion. He was an older, impeccably dressed man with a quiet, dignified air and eyes that seemed to see everything. He listened politely as Benjamin launched into his well-rehearsed pitch about synergy and market disruption, but his expression remained impassive, his reserve impenetrable. It was clear the standard corporate schmoozing was having little effect. The conversation stalled, and Jane felt a knot of anxiety tighten for Benjamin. Then, Mr. Tanaka's gaze fell upon the intricate, abstract pin on his own lapel. "A gift from my wife," he explained, a hint of warmth entering his voice for the first time. "She has a great passion for the arts, particularly modern sculpture. She finds beauty in forms that others find challenging." It was the opening Jane had been waiting for, a conversational thread she could grasp. She stepped forward slightly, her expression one of genuine interest. "Is that a piece by Emisato?" she asked, naming a niche but brilliant contemporary Japanese artist she admired. "The way she works with reclaimed metals is extraordinary. It reminds me of the Art Institute's new installation, the way they've curated the North Garden to create a dialogue between the industrial and the organic." It was as if she had spoken a magic word. Mr. Tanaka's entire demeanor changed. His eyes lit up with genuine delight. "You know, Sato's work?" The business talk was forgotten. For the next 15 minutes, Jane and Mr. Tanaka engaged in a lively, passionate discussion about art, design, and the philosophy of aesthetics. She spoke with an eloquence born from years of solitary study and a deep, authentic love for her craft, framing her insights through the sophisticated lens of Isabel Thornton, the curator. Benjamin stood by, silent and stunned, watching as she effortlessly built a bridge of genuine connection that his millions and his PowerPoints could not. When the conversation finally wound down, Mr. Tanaka turned to Benjamin, a broad, warm smile on his face. He clapped him firmly on the shoulder. "A man is known by the company he keeps, Davenport," he said, his voice full of newfound respect. Your Isabel has a remarkable eye for quality. Remarkable. We must continue our business discussion next week. Flushed with a victory that felt more personal than professional, Benjamin grasped her elbow, his touch surprisingly gentle, and steered her through the throng of people. Come with me, he murmured, his voice low and urgent. He led her away from the cacophony of the ballroom, through a set of tall French doors and out onto a secluded rooftop terrace. The cool night air was a welcome relief, and the sudden quiet was broken only by the distant hum of city traffic. Below them, the lights of Chicago spread out like a carpet of fallen stars. He walked to the balustrade, resting his hands on the cool stone and staring out at the skyline, his shoulders losing some of their rigid tension. Jane stood beside him, a silent partner in the sudden armistice. "How did you do that?" he asked. Finally, his voice laced with genuine awe as he turned to face her. "With Tanaka, I've been trying to get that kind of breakthrough with him for 6 months. My whole team has. And you did it in 15 minutes by talking about sculpture." She simply shrugged, a small, self-conscious gesture. "I listened," she said. "He didn't want to talk about business. He wanted to talk about something he loved. It's not that complicated." He shook his head, a wry, disbelieving smile touching his lips. You maybe." He looked at her then, his gaze intense and stripped of all pretense. "You were incredible tonight, Jane. Not as Isabel, as you." The use of her real name was a shock, an intimate sound in the vast emptiness of the rooftop. "This gala," he continued, his voice dropping, becoming more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "This deal with Tanaka, it's not just about expansion, it's about survival. My father built Innovatech from nothing. I inherited it, and all the pressure that comes with his legacy. Victoria Sterling is on my board. She's been waiting for me to falter, gathering allies, ready to call for a vote of no confidence. If I lose this deal, she has all the ammunition she needs to take everything from me." He paused, the confession hanging in the air between them, a fragile, human thing. He looked as if he wanted to say more, as if he were on the precipice of a deeper revelation. "The real reason I couldn't bring a real date tonight," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "The reason I needed this to be a transaction is because—" He cut himself off abruptly, turning away to look back at the city, the invisible armor of the CEO sliding back into place. The moment of connection was severed, leaving Jane with a heart full of questions and a dangerous, burgeoning sense of empathy for the lonely man in the expensive tuxedo. The intensity of the rooftop confession left Jane feeling breathless and disoriented. She needed a moment to herself, a quiet space to process the dizzying shift from a simple business transaction to a high-stakes battle for a man's legacy. She murmured an excuse about needing the powder room and slipped back inside, leaving Benjamin alone with his thoughts and the glittering skyline. The ballroom seemed louder and more garish than before. As she made her way through the maze of tables, she passed a secluded alcove, partially hidden by a large potted palm. A familiar, cutting voice sliced through the din, and Jane instinctively froze in the shadows. It was Victoria Sterling. "He's distracted," Victoria said, her voice a low, venomous purr. "This curator is the perfect blind spot. He thinks he's shored up the Tanaka deal. He's feeling confident. He won't see it coming." A man's deeper voice responded, laced with caution. "Are you sure about this, Victoria? A personal scandal is a dirty play, even for us. It could backfire." Victoria's laugh was a short, chilling sound, utterly devoid of humor. "All's fair in love and hostile takeovers, darling. He brought this girl into our world. That makes her fair game. I want to know everything about her, find out who she really is. I don't care what it takes or what it costs. I want something I can use at the emergency board meeting I'm calling for Monday morning. His reputation will be in tatters before the market opens for trading. He won't know what hit him." Jane stood paralyzed behind the palm, her blood turning to ice, her heart hammered against. Her ribs, a frantic trapped bird. This wasn't just corporate maneuvering, this was a premeditated, ruthless character assassination, and she, Jane Morales, was the unwitting weapon they planned to use against him. The $20,000 suddenly felt like 30 pieces of silver. Returning to the ballroom was like re-entering a dream that had twisted into a nightmare. Every smiling face seemed to hold a hidden threat. Every polite conversation felt like an interrogation. Her mind was racing, a chaotic flood of fear and frantic calculation. The deal had been simple: show up, play a part, collect the money, and disappear back into her own life, her own problems. She could still do that. She could finish the night, walk away, and let the corporate titans destroy each other. It wasn't her fight. She had fulfilled her end of the bargain. The money for Leo's surgery was all but guaranteed. Protecting herself, and by extension her brother, was the only logical, sensible thing to do. But then she looked across the glittering room and saw Benjamin. He was fending off Marcus Thorne, the rival she'd been warned about, and though his smile was in place, she could now see the profound strain around his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw. She saw not the powerful billionaire CEO, but the vulnerable man on the rooftop, confessing his deepest fears of failure, a son trying desperately to honor his father's legacy. Running away would save her from humiliation, but it would be a tacit betrayal, leaving him defenseless against an attack she now knew was coming. In that moment, something inside her shifted, a fundamental realignment of her own moral calculus. This was no longer just his problem. They had made it hers. Fulfilling her contract was no longer enough. Her silence would make her complicit. And Jane Morales, who had spent her entire life fighting from the shadows, decided it was time to fight back. As if Victoria could sense Jane's shift in allegiance from across the room, the attack began subtly. Jane noticed a slim, dark-haired young man in a waiter's uniform who wasn't serving anyone. He was lingering near a marble column, his focus entirely on her. As she laughed at a joke from one of Benjamin's acquaintances, the young man lifted his phone, shielding it with a tray. The flash was almost imperceptible in the brilliantly lit room, but Jane, a creature accustomed to observing from the periphery, caught the tiny glint of light. A cold wave of dread washed over her. It was Victoria's assistant. They were already digging. Her carefully constructed identity as Isabel Thornton was a house of cards, and the first gust of wind had just blown through the room. A short while later, as Jane was momentarily separated from Benjamin, Victoria materialized at her side like a malevolent ghost, her smile fixed and dazzling. "Having a wonderful time, dear," she purred, her eyes sweeping over the sapphire necklace. "It's a beautiful piece. Ben always did have impeccable taste in accessories." The emphasis on the last word was a clear, demeaning jab. "But you know, borrowed things have a way of getting returned, don't they? Sometimes quite abruptly." The threat, wrapped in the guise of polite party chatter, was as sharp and cold as an icicle pressed against her skin. Jane met her gaze, refusing to flinch. "And sometimes," she countered, her voice low and even, "you find they're worth more than the person who loaned them ever realized." Victoria's smile tightened, but before she could retort, Benjamin was back at their side, blissfully unaware of the venomous exchange. The final devastating blow came near the end of the evening. Jane, needing to escape the suffocating tension, slipped out of the ballroom and into a quiet, mahogany-paneled corridor that led back towards the terrace. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for just a second, trying to will her racing heart to slow down. When she opened them, Victoria, Sterling was standing in front of her, blocking her path. The polite, smiling mask was gone. Her face was a study in cold, triumphant fury. "The game is over," Victoria said, her voice a low, vicious hiss. "I know you're not Isabel Thornton. You'd be amazed what a good facial recognition program and a well-paid private investigator can dig up in a few hours. A little freelance graphic design portfolio, a mountain of medical debt for a brother named Leo, and, most deliciously, a current employment record, Innovatech Tower, night shift, janitorial staff. Each word was a physical blow, stripping away Jane's defenses, leaving her raw and exposed. Her breath hitched in her throat. The world seemed to tilt and spin. Victoria took a step closer, savoring her victory. "So here is what is going to happen," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "In approximately 10 minutes, my dear friend, the host of this gala is going to invite me to the stage to say a few words about the new philanthropic fund, and in my little speech, I'm going to tell this entire city, all of these reporters, the very story I just told you. I will paint a picture of a desperate, manipulative little cleaner who conned a great CEO. Your humiliation will be legendary, and Benjamin's career, his reputation for judgment, it will be over before the champagne glasses are cleared." She smiled, a triumphant, cruel curving of her lips that made Jane's stomach clench. "Now, if you'll excuse me," Victoria said, her voice once again light and cheerful, "I have an announcement to prepare." She swept past, leaving Jane utterly alone in the hallway, the walls closing in, the impending doom a deafening roar in her ears. Her carefully constructed world about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. For a long, silent moment in the mahogany-paneled corridor, Jane Morales ceased to exist. There was only a hollow ringing in her ears and the sensation of the plush carpet falling away beneath her feet. Victoria's parting words echoed in the sudden, terrifying emptiness. "Your humiliation will be legendary." Every nerve ending, every primal instinct screamed at her to run. The service corridors she navigated every night were a familiar map in her mind. She could slip out a side exit and be swallowed by the anonymous Chicago night within minutes. She could disappear. Disappearing meant survival. It meant she would never have to face the hundreds of judging eyes in that ballroom, never have to see the pity and contempt on their faces. She could retreat back to the comforting invisibility of her own life, to her small apartment in Pilsen, and this entire glittering, nightmarish ordeal would become a story she would never, ever tell. The money would be gone, of course, a check that would surely be cancelled the moment the scandal broke. The thought of Leo, of Dr. Evans's kind but worried face, was a physical blow, winding her. But the alternative, the public crucifixion Victoria had so gleefully promised, felt unsurvivable. She saw the headlines, the sneering gossip columns, her face plastered everywhere as a cautionary tale. It would be a brand of shame that would follow her forever, a stain that no amount of hard work or talent could ever wash away. Her hand was on the handle of a heavy service door when she froze. The thought of running, so logical and necessary a moment ago, now felt like a different kind of defeat. It meant that Victoria Sterling and every person like her who had ever made Jane feel small, underestimated, and worthless would win. They would have the final word on who she was. She thought of Benjamin. She pictured his face not as the commanding CEO, but as the haunted man on the rooftop, carrying the weight of a legacy he was terrified to tarnish. She had accepted his money to be a prop, a placeholder, but somewhere along the way, in a shared, unexpected laugh over a pair of ridiculous shoes, in a moment of genuine connection over a piece of art, in the quiet confession of his fears under the stars, a fragile, unspoken alliance had been forged. To run now would not just be self-preservation, it would be an act of profound betrayal. Leaving him alone and defenseless against the wolves, a quiet, defiant anger began to burn through the icy fog of her fear. She had spent her life fighting. She had fought for her education, fought for her art, and was fighting every single day for her brother's life. She would not stop fighting now. With a steadying breath that felt like drawing a line in the sand, she let go of the door handle, turned, and walked back towards the glittering chaos of the ballroom. She was going to face the storm, but she was not going to face it alone. She found Benjamin near the grand stage, his back to her, a deep furrow of concern in his brow as he scanned the crowd, clearly looking for her. She grabbed his arm, pulling him with an urgency that made him startle. "Jane, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." She towed him into the same secluded alcove where she had overheard the plot, the irony a bitter taste in her mouth. "Worse," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate torrent. "Benjamin, it's over. Victoria knows. She knows everything. She knows who I am, that I'm a cleaner in your building. She knows about Leo, all of it. She has people. They found me. She's going on stage right now in a few minutes, and she's going to tell everyone. She's going to expose me to humiliate you. She's going to destroy you." For a second, he just stared at her, his face a blank mask of shock. She saw a dozen emotions flicker in his eyes: disbelief, confusion, and then a flash of cold, hard fury that wasn't directed at her but at Victoria. He didn't recoil from her. He didn't blame her. In that crucial, defining moment, he looked at her not as the source of his impending ruin, but as his partner in a shared crisis. His entire demeanor shifted, the CEO's mask dissolving to reveal the fighter beneath. His mind, sharpened by years of corporate warfare, moved with astonishing speed. The shock was replaced by a cold, calculated focus. "Your sketchbook," he said, his voice low and sharp, cutting through her panic. "The one I saw in the conference room, your designs. Is your portfolio on your phone?" Jane was so taken aback by the question that she could only stammer, "What? My portfolio? Benjamin, did you hear what I said? Is it on your phone?" he repeated, his intensity unwavering. "Are the designs any good?" The question was so absurd, so completely disconnected from the impending social annihilation, that it momentarily shocked her out of her terror. They're my life's work," she whispered, the words feeling achingly vulnerable. "Show me," he commanded, already pulling his own phone from his pocket. "Email me the files, the highest resolution you have. Do it now." With trembling fingers, she navigated through her phone, her muscle memory taking over as she found the folder labeled Portfolio, and sent the attachment to the email address he recited. While she typed, he was already making a call, his back turned to her slightly. "David, it's Davenport. Yes, right now. I need you to override the AV feed to the main stage projectors. I'm forwarding you a file from my email. I need you to get it queued up immediately. Don't ask questions. Just do it and wait for my signal." He hung up and turned back to her, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, brilliant audacity. He took her hand, his grip firm and steadying. "Stay with me," he said, "and whatever happens, do not look away." They emerged from the alcove just as the gala's host, a silver-haired philanthropist, was on stage, tapping the microphone. "And now," the man announced with a beaming smile, "I'd like to invite a woman whose contributions to our city's business and cultural landscape are immeasurable, a pillar of the community, Miss Victoria Sterling." A wave of polite applause rippled through the ballroom as Victoria glided onto the stage, accepting the microphone with the practiced grace of a performer who owned the spotlight. She looked out over the crowd, her gaze sweeping the room before landing with pinpoint accuracy on Jane. A small, triumphant smirk played on her lips. Jane felt Benjamin's hand tighten on her own. He gave her a single sharp nod, a silent command to hold fast. Victoria began her speech, her voice smooth as silk, weaving a tapestry of platitudes about corporate responsibility, community, and the importance of integrity. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost breathtaking. "But integrity isn't just about balance sheets and profit margins," Victoria purred, her voice taking on a new, more serious tone as she leaned into the microphone. Her eyes, cold and bright, found Jane once more. "It's about the company we keep. It's about honesty. And sometimes we find that the people we are meant to trust are not who they appear to be at all. Take, for example, our host for this evening, Innovatech's own CEO, Mr. Benjamin Davenport. She paused for dramatic effect, ready to deliver the killing blow, the final, humiliating reveal. But in that perfectly calibrated moment of silence, Benjamin let go of Jane's hand and began to walk calmly and purposefully towards the stage. He moved not with frantic haste, but with an unshakable, commanding authority that drew every eye in the room. He reached the stage and, to Victoria's utter astonishment, took the second microphone from the podium. "Victoria, thank you," he said, his voice ringing out, clear and strong, through the ballroom's sound system. "Thank you for that perfect introduction to a subject I feel very passionately about." Victoria stared at him, her face a mask of confusion and sputtering rage, her carefully orchestrated moment stolen. "You're absolutely right," Benjamin continued, addressing the captivated audience. "True value is very often not what it appears to be on the surface. In fact, you've just inspired me to make a special, unplanned announcement tonight." He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible signal towards the back of the room. The massive screens flanking the stage, which had been displaying the gala's elegant logo, flickered and went dark. A collective gasp went through the room. Then the screens flooded with brilliant, breathtaking color. It was one of Jane's designs, a stunning, dynamic logo for a fictional music festival, alive with energy and ingenuity. Then another image appeared, a sophisticated branding concept for a boutique hotel, then a powerful poster for a social justice campaign. Her life's work, her secret passion, her very soul, was on display for this entire world to see. The entire ballroom was silent, mesmerized by the sheer talent and creativity radiating from the screens. The designs were undeniably brilliant, imbued with a fresh, innovative spirit that was electrifying. Jane stood frozen, tears blurring her vision, her heart feeling as though it might burst from her chest. Benjamin's voice cut through the silence, filled with a pride and passion that was utterly genuine. "Tonight, Innovatech is officially launching a new philanthropic venture," he announced, his voice resonating with power and conviction. "It will be called the Chicago Discovery Grant, and it will be an annual endowment dedicated to finding and funding our city's most brilliant undiscovered artistic talent. We believe that genius can be found anywhere, and it is our duty to provide opportunities for that genius to flourish." He paused, turning to look directly at Jane, his gaze locking with hers across the crowded room, creating an intimate, unshakable connection that obliterated everyone else. "And I can think of no one more talented, more deserving, or more inspiring to be the grant's very first recipient than the incredible artist whose work you see behind me now." The room was silent for a beat, processing the stunning reversal. "Ladies and gentlemen," Benjamin declared, his voice full of pride, "Ms. Jane Morales." For a moment there was stunned silence, and then the room erupted. The applause was not polite or restrained. It was a thunderous, overwhelming ovation, a genuine appreciation for the talent on the screens and the incredible story that had just unfolded. Jane was immediately swarmed, no longer an object of impending scorn, but of intense, admiring curiosity. People who had looked through her hours before were now pressing in, congratulating her, asking about her work. She saw Mr. Tanaka making his way towards Benjamin, his face split in a wide, admiring grin as he shook Benjamin's hand with unrestrained enthusiasm. "Davenport, that was genius," his voice boomed. "Absolute genius. Vision. This is the kind of forward-thinking, out-of-the-box leadership I want to be in business with. You find talent anywhere. My team will call yours in the morning. The deal is done." Across the stage, Victoria Sterling stood utterly defeated, her face pale with fury and public humiliation. Her perfectly laid trap had not only failed, but had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable, solidifying her rival's reputation as a compassionate visionary, while exposing her as a cruel, petty bully. Her career-ending scandal had become his career-defining triumph. Benjamin gracefully extracted himself from the crowd and made his way to Jane, creating a small, protective bubble around them amidst the chaos. He simply looked at her, his eyes saying more than words ever could. The professional threat had been neutralized. The social humiliation had been transformed into a city-wide celebration of her talent. And in the middle of it all, they were no longer a CEO and his fake date. They were simply two people who had faced down a dragon and won. Later that night, when the applause had faded and the crowds had thinned, they found themselves back on the quiet rooftop terrace, the city lights a silent, glittering witness below. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, trembling intimacy that was more profound than anything they had shared before. Jane leaned against the balustrade, the cool night air a balm on her flushed cheeks. "I can't believe you did that," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You took the ugliest thing a person could do and turned it into something beautiful. You didn't have to save me." Benjamin came to stand beside her, his presence a warm, solid comfort. "Yes, I did," he said, his voice soft but certain. "And you have it wrong. You weren't the one who needed saving. I was. Victoria was right about one thing tonight. True value is often hidden in plain sight. I was just too blind and arrogant to see what was right in front of me all along." He reached out, his fingers gently brushing her neck as he undid the clasp of the heavy sapphire necklace. The cool weight vanished. He pressed the glittering piece into her palm, its stones feeling like cold, meaningless glass. "This belongs to Isabel Thornton," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers. "She was a useful fabrication, but I'm much more interested in getting to know Jane Morales. The contract, the pretense, the $20,000, all of it dissolved into the night air. The power imbalance that had defined their relationship was gone, stripped away by the shared battle and the mutual respect it had forged, leaving only two people, finally on equal ground, standing under the vast, starlit sky. 6 months later, the world was a different color. Jane stood in the center of a bright, airy gallery space in the West Loop, the scent of fresh paint and possibility in the air. Sunlight streamed through the industrial-sized windows, illuminating the walls, which were covered in her work. It was the setup day for her first solo exhibition, fully funded by the Innovatech grant. She was directing 2 installers, pointing to a large canvas, her voice confident and clear, a joyful energy radiating from her that had been absent for far too long. She was no longer a ghost gliding through the 50th floor. She was a creator in her own space, building her own future. The gallery door chimed, and she turned, a professional smile ready for a visitor. It was Benjamin. But he wasn't the CEO of Innovatech. He was dressed in dark jeans and a simple grey Henley, looking relaxed and completely out of place in the art world, yet perfectly at home. He wasn't carrying a briefcase or a business proposal. He was holding 2 paper cups from a familiar, beloved brand. "Cortado with oat milk, right?" he asked, his smile gentle and a little nervous. "From that little cafe in Pilsen you like. I figured you might need a break." The gesture was so small, so thoughtful, so profoundly personal, that it struck her with more force than any grand public declaration ever could. It told her that he had been paying attention, that he had taken the time to learn the details of her world, not as a curiosity, but as something important to him. She felt a real, unguarded smile spread across her face as she accepted the warm cup. "I was in the neighborhood," he continued, a hopeful light in his eyes, "and I was wondering if the brilliant artist Jane Morales might be free for lunch with her biggest fan."